I want you to move from overwhelmed by information to confident in what really matters. I want to help you move from being unsure towards direction and purpose in your healthcare. I want to introduce you to health experts. I want to let you in on tough conversations on women's health. I want to give you a place where you can lean in and learn how to take care of yourself. Let's transform your health. Let's get clear on your goals. This is Women's Health Unplugged. I'm your host, Dr. Jordan Robertson, naturopathic doctor. Welcome to our last episode of 2020. I'm Dr. Jordan Robertson, and I'm the host of Women's Health Unplugged. This is our last episode of the year, and it's falling on a Thursday, which we always release episodes on Thursday, and it happens to be New Year's Eve. So I thought I would do a recap and discussion around wellness trends that I hope to see emerge in 2021 and have a little bit of a reflection on 2020, which arguably is maybe the weirdest year that we have all lived through. You know, I've looked at these lists a million times over my career, these, top 5 trends to look for in the subsequent year or the best wellness trends to, promise you living forever and all of your health goals achieved. I don't know how things become trendy. And I think where I struggle with the word trend is that it implies that the thing, whatever it is that we're talking about, is going to be relatively short-lived. Some of my favorite cartoon memes around wellness trends, involve, like all hail kale and, spinach, you're dead to us. And it's this idea that if something is becoming trendy, it's a short-lived burst of fame for this particular food or item or whatever, and that last year's conversation is dead and gone. So whatever we thought was special and important last year now is no longer trendy, and we're going to throw it in the garbage. And then now it's like the bright, shiny new object, whether it's kale or coconut oil or whatnot. So I want to move away from that kind of conversation about trends and actually think about it more as what are we learning in 2020 and what do we want to pull forward into 2021 and evolve even further? What do I want to see the conversations be like in my office in 2021? What do I want the focus of future research in women's health? What do I want to see content being created about in women's health? That's what I want to focus on today, because I think the way that we create a movement or a trend is, dispersing good quality education, which is something I'm always trying to do with the podcast. But also just to have a great number of people talking about a particular concept. I think that's what starts to create that momentum and movement. If we get enough people talking about, getting their vitamin D levels tested at their doctor, that's where we start to see a shift and change in the way that we practice medicine and the way that we consume medicine even as women. So that's what I want to focus on with my list. And I think I have 6 things on my list because, of course, why wouldn't I choose 6? It's such a random number. But before we do that, I want to just reflect a little bit on 2020 and what that year was like for me personally, but also what I noticed in the women that I worked with over the last year and reflect a little bit on our processes for the podcast. So, as we all know, the big, I don't even want to call it a highlight, but the big newsworthy item for 2020 was definitely COVID-19 and the coronavirus pandemic. And what that did for women living in Canada, living in Ontario, living in North America, really highlighted some of the challenges I think that we were having with our modern life prior to the pandemic, and certainly amplified some of those challenges, especially my working from home mothers who were suddenly laced with, different, more additional roles and responsibilities on top of their regular responsibilities, right? So it wasn't like, we gave women time off work and had them work as educators and teachers from home or as primary caregivers during the day where they had previously had more support. We took away support from, the multi-generational family, right? Where grandparents were encouraged not to help work with families of small children because of their own personal risk of, COVID-19. I think we saw this like amplification of like our life before COVID was perhaps a little bit too action-packed and too busy. I even know from our own family watching the extracurricular activities melt away, suddenly we realized that, on any given Saturday, we would be going to the gym and Home Depot and a birthday party and probably back to Home Depot because I'm sure we forgot something. And we live in the country. And so just the sheer number of kilometers that we were driving on a weekend day and how that was kind of like the opposite of restoration and rest and what we needed. And it wasn't until we were kind of forced to do that could we even really reflect on and even get to ask ourselves the question, like, was all of that even necessary? But the other thing that 2020 did was put pressure on, some of the routines that were actually working in our favor. So I watched women who were signed up for 5K races have them canceled, or women who had just got themselves into a really good routine with their exercise now find themselves, surfing the internet rather than doing an at-home class. I even myself really struggled working out from home at the beginning. I think I exercised maybe once in the first 6 or 8 weeks of lockdown and thought that one time was going to be this, me changing the guard and I was going to start exercising every day. And it turned out it was just like one random day when I didn't burst into tears when I touched my barbell. And I happened to make it through a workout, but then I didn't go back out into the garage for almost another month after that. So I watched the people's routines get sort of ripped out from underneath them. And I think that emphasized how important those habits are. Saw a great quote online recently that said, habits are there for when your mood is not. And I think that this, the COVID-19 experience for many of us really highlighted the importance of that accountability and routine and community, because without it, I know I personally, and I also watched many of you in my one-on-one clinical practice, struggled to be consistent with actions that previously had felt really effortless, right? So making a smoothie and going to work and throwing your gym bag in the trunk, these felt like effortless patterns. And when the disruption of quarantine and COVID and lockdown and gyms closed and all of those things, the disruption was enough that we couldn't actually maintain those habits through that. And my patients who I think were the most successful through COVID were the ones whose routines were not impacted. So maybe they perhaps already did at-home workouts, or they were able to pivot really quickly and establish new routines really quick. I, for one, was not one of those people. So I found the exercise piece really challenging and really did not get back into it until the gyms reopened. And subsequently, now that we're back into a 28-day lockdown in Southern Ontario. And so I'm about to try and establish better routines from the beginning. So it kind of highlighted some interesting things just about our patterns of behavior, that A, we probably had way too much on our plate prior. B, routines were, are incredibly successful strategies for helping patients achieve their health goals, whatever that is. And then the last is that, I think the emotional burden of working from home, parenting, caregiving, and all of that was taking a toll on my patients in a way that we haven't seen before. And that's going to lead into one of my hopeful wellness trends for 2021, with the very first one being self-compassion. So I hope that what you learned from 2020 is something that you can use to be a springboard into 2021. I think there's a lot of positive commentary online about how this isn't necessarily the year that we want to forget, but it's a year that we want to sort of deeply learn from and maybe recreate a life that has more meaning or more purpose or more intention than what we had before. It was a real pattern disruptor in our life where, yeah, some of those patterns were super positive and I can't wait to get them back, like exercise. But other patterns weren't as positive as maybe we originally hoped they would be. And we get to re-examine that and we get to pull things back in that are really relevant or purposeful, and we get to leave things out that aren't. So I hope that rounding out the year for you, that we can have a shred of gratitude for the kind of experience that we've had. And I know even as a small business owner and working in healthcare, I feel all of the pains that all of you are also feeling about this experience of being in lockdown and all the things that came with that. But I hope when we move into 2021 that the trends that creates in the way that we use healthcare as women, actually that 2020 propels us into doing something different with our health. So moving into my list, so I'm going to read you my whole list before we dive into each particular topic. So I've decided, and this is in no particular order, this was me just writing them out, that I want our 2020 wellness trends to be the following. So number one, I want us to exercise self-compassion and for the conversation about self-compassion to be front and center for 2021. Number two is I want to see more discussion around the importance of tracking the menstrual cycle and helping women understand their hormones. Number three, I want to see us getting our vitamin D levels checked, and I want us to re-examine the importance of adequate vitamin D levels. Number four, I want the wellness trend around nutrition for women to be focused on protein adequacy and helping women learn what their actual protein needs are. If I think back over the nutrition wellness trends over the last few years, there has been a lot of really drastic and extreme dietary trends out there. And none of them have really focused on how to fuel women for daily performance, longevity, reducing the risk of bone loss and muscle mass. And so I want to focus on that one. We'll circle back to it. Number five is I want to see a focus on sleep and recovery as part of healthcare and being as equally as relevant and important as performance. And when I say performance, I don't just mean athletic performance. I mean daily performance. And number six, I want to see the wellness trend to be focused on gratitude journals and the actual active practice of gratitude work. So that's my whole list. And so I want to go through them each one by one and kind of give you a little bit of a lowdown about where I think this trend comes from and why, from a research perspective, do we care about all of these things? Because technically, these are actually all evidence-based suggestions, even the ones that sound a little bit airy-fairy. We know in the evidence that these are actually things that can have a positive impact on our health, especially given the year that we have just had. I think focusing on a couple of these things is going to be important for propelling your health forward. So the first item on my list is self-compassion. And I think I've been working on this concept of self-compassion with myself and with my patients for years, but didn't have the language to put towards it. Not until I recently read an article that specifically looked at sort of the personality traits and the practices that influenced a woman's menopause experience. So I read the articles that come out around women's health all the time, and somehow this article, which was published in 2015, had actually slid past me. But I was looking into how to best support women around weight management when it comes to menopause. And I would say that particular topic for women is where there's so much negativity, there's so much self-sabotage, there's so much shame, that I came across this particular article that looked at self-compassion and actually gave me language to then further search more on this topic. And I have spent quite a bit of time looking at this concept of self-compassion and how to support patients in having more compassion towards themselves. A good question to ask yourself, when you're talking through all of those should statements, right? I should be doing this. I should be exercising. I should start a nutrition plan. I should be going back to the chiropractor. When we say those things, right, one of the tools I use with my patients is asking them to reflect on, how would they coach another woman who's in their circumstances, who uses those phrases or that language to talk to herself? Or would you, watching another woman who was in a very similar circumstance to you, would you say those things to that woman, right? And I think we can think back to maybe our darkest days of quarantine and COVID and working from home and isolation and sadness, right? And then we reach for the cookie, right? And to ourselves, we are very harsh, right? To ourselves, we don't have the same level of empathy and compassion as we would for another human being. So I think if you saw a woman who was crying and in despair and overwhelmed and all of those things, and she reached for a cookie, what would you say to her, right? You would probably say, hey, you know what? Like, it's fine. Don't beat yourself up. Have the cookie. It's cool. You'll probably feel better tomorrow. This isn't going to last forever. You're strong. You're talented. You're smart, right? You got this. The kind of words and phrases that we use to help that woman, right? Either to encourage her to, to make it through this tough time, or to acknowledge her pain, or to even acknowledge why she's eating this stupid cookie, right? All of those phrases that you would use towards someone else, we have a hard time doing that to ourselves. And so especially when we're starting to talk around, health and wellness as we come through the COVID experience, I think we're going to see a real push in the marketing and in media for us to get back to our pre-COVID life or pre-COVID fitness or pre-COVID body or whatever, target angle they want to take. This concept of self-compassion actually is incredibly vital for maintaining mental health and wellness. And where it piqued my interest actually was that it actually showed up as a strategy for helping women cope with physical symptoms as well. This is what really piqued my interest, is in this particular study, they basically examined a woman's ability to have self-compassion for herself and then compared it against her hot flashes, compared it against her actual physical symptoms related to menopause. And the psychological aspect that was the most strongly linked to her physical symptoms was her self-compassion. So women who rated really high on self-compassion, and they defined it a little better in the study where they said, women who accepted and her aging, who felt like she was aging with grace and intention, who welcomed this process and change and recognized it to be natural and that what her body was going through, that she had strength to go through this, versus the woman who was like resisting it or saw herself as aging, or that aging was a negative experience, or I was use the word white knuckling it through her menopause, right? Like gripping her 40s with her last, fingernails and resenting this concept of aging. There was a massive difference in the physical symptoms of these women. So the women who embraced her aging experience and who loved herself and who had this compassion for those moments of having a hot flash, right? So even in going into a hot flash, being able to say, this is okay. This is not embarrassing. This is something that's going to happen to me. I am strong. I am deserving, right? Like not deserving of the hot flash. I mean like deserving of good. She overall had just had less hot flashes than the woman who was like angry at the situation. And we actually see this across multiple disciplines. So that was the article that piqued my interest because it was actually related to physical symptoms, which I think is so cool. But there's been multiple studies specifically done on burnout in healthcare professionals and students, which that's an age group and a conversation I love to have is around how we better support or like young adults as they transition to university or college or secondary education, and how we support them to have better stress response and mental health. And so self-compassion has been shown in many studies to reduce stress and anxiety and depression. And that's across all ages, that's across all disciplines. There's studies that look at it in caregivers, right? Caregivers of older aging adults or parents, that the more self-compassion that individuals have, the more resilient their mental health is in facing all of these challenges. So there's been some great work done on self-compassion. Dr. Kristen Neff is a researcher in the US, and she has really taken on this concept of self-compassion. She's been the one to head up all the studies on self-compassion scales and things that we want to use in the medical literature in order to evaluate self-compassion. And the reason I bring her up is because I quite like the way that she defines it. She basically says self-compassion involves acting the same way towards yourself when you are having a difficult time, or notice something you don't like about yourself, that you act towards yourself kind of the same way, whether like something good is happening or something not good is happening. So she says, instead of ignoring your pain with a stiff upper lip, you tell yourself, like, this is really difficult right now, and how can I support myself in this moment? And so it's about, instead of judging and criticizing yourself, it means you're kind and understanding when you're confronted with, she says, personal failings. Because of course we're not supposed to be perfect, and we can see that so easily in other people, but it's very difficult to do it for ourselves. She's got some great resources, which I'm going to post in the show notes that you can go and read. She talks about what self-compassion is not as well, which I actually love the conversation that she's had here, because it reminds me of our conversation around intuitive eating. So when we say to women, you need to trust yourself, you need to eat more intuitively and trust that you know what your body needs. Women imagine that the moment they give themselves permission to eat whatever they feel like, that they're going to stand in front of the freezer and binge eat cookies, dipped in ice cream with whipped cream on them, and, indefinitely. And that's not actually what happens, right? Women may do that on the first day because they've been restricting their diet for so long, but they actually come to a decent ebb and flow with the addition of yummy treats, but also, intuitively realizing that she needs more whole, healthy foods in her life as well. So when we talk to patients about self-compassion, they often view it very similarly to the way that women fear intuitive eating. And they say, well, if I give in to myself and if I let myself rest, I'm just going to end up a lazy person sitting on the couch watching Netflix forever. If I'm not hard on myself, I will just never complete any other work projects ever again, and I will become a total failure, right? And it's because it feels self-indulgent, right? It feels like pity to give in to yourself to rest, to acknowledge that your plate is a little bit too full, to forgive yourself for having a hard time. It sounds like, by giving yourself permission to do that, there is that tendency or fear to think that you're just going to be indefinitely self-indulgent and you're never going to be motivated to do anything again, because if you're not hard on yourself, nobody will be, yada, yada, yada. You can, I'm sure, hear this internal chatter that if you gave yourself permission to rest when you were tired, or gave yourself permission to say no, or acknowledged your shortcomings in a very neutral and loving way, that it may seem that you are indefinitely going to allow yourself to, work towards a very, very low bar. But that's not actually true. Self-compassion is way more about treating yourself and having empathy for yourself very similarly to the capacity that you're able to have it for other people. And even just starting there, right, is a really good strategy for helping think a little bit differently about yourself and to start to have that self-compassion. And the research on it is so deep. And so I would love to see this be a wellness trend. And I think coming out of last year, where the expectations were high, the support was low, right? All of those things, I think we can have that level of compassion. I even think as I'm recording this particular podcast, I am like in my bedroom with the door closed, hoping cats don't meow, with my kids playing outside. And I'm hoping that they can make it while I record through the whole thing out in the snow. Whereas 8 months ago, I never would have recorded at home. I only would record in a soundproof room alone with, no breaks, and the transition from that to this involved quite a bit of It's okay if it's not perfect, Jordan. It's okay if a cat meows in the back of a podcast recording. It's okay if you have to do this in 2 takes. It's okay if your kids barge in. It's okay if you are, balancing your microphone on your stomach in your bedroom to do this. We've had a lot of those moments over 2020 where we've had to change our expectations of ourselves. I want you to have compassion for yourself around those changes. And then moving in towards 2021, I want you to carry that with you so that when you're faced with new difficulties and new challenges, that you can still maintain that same level of compassion for yourself. That's why I want this to be a wellness trend going into 2021. I think we've learned an awful lot about it in 2020. I want it to just continue. The next wellness trend for 2021 is for women to actually deeply understand what's going on with their cycle. And this relates really well to our self-compassion because women are not meant to feel the same way every day, or they don't feel the same way every day, I should say. And this is something that if women can tap into, they can be so much more productive and so much happier in their life. This is why I want this to be a focus. So cycle tracking historically has been so much about fertility, right? It's been so much about, ovulation and getting pregnant. And for women who either were choosing not to have children, women who were not at that time of their life where they were considering having children, or women who were past the point in their life where they were going to have more children, we really de-emphasized the importance of the cycle. And I have some great conversations coming up in the new year about what that does to women when we just either ignore ovulation or suppress ovulation, specifically with the oral contraceptive pill. But your own natural production of hormones and that ebb and flow, that 28-day-ish cycle that you have is actually a beautiful piece of your health that women can actually leverage if they come to understand it. And, showing up every single day with the expectations that you're going to feel the same every day, I think sets women up for a little bit of shame and failure. And again, if we can teach women to understand their cycle, they can lean into it. One of my favorite books that I read in 2020 was actually Do Less by Kate Northrup. And this whole concept, the book is really for mothers. It's really geared towards mothers. However, the concepts she talks about it are for women in general, where the different states through the different phases of the menstrual cycle can actually be harnessed and leveraged in order to feel happier and more productive in your life. And that doesn't just mean getting more shit done. It means like understanding that you're going to have different times of the month where you feel differently, and we want to use that to our advantage. I was using that in my own life already before I read the book, and having loose conversations with patients about it as well, that especially in the time of PMS, and if women were struggling during PMS, that I wanted them to have more compassion, and there's my word again, with themselves, but also recognizing that burning themselves into the ground or running themselves into the ground during their follicular phase, like the first half of their cycle, was actually setting them up for more PMS in the second half of their cycle. So this was a concept that I was teaching women before anyways, and we also in medicine use cycle tracking to help women understand if their symptoms are actually hormonal or not. So the research actually suggests that women have a really hard time, and this I'd add the caveat here. This was before the invention of cycle tracking apps, which I will say has completely changed my life at work. But prior to the invention of cycle tracking apps, women had a really hard time estimating if their symptoms were related to their cycle or not. So there were a couple of studies that specifically looked at breast pain. They tracked the women's menstrual cycles slyly, and then had them pinpoint whether or not they thought the breast pain they were experiencing was correlated with their cycle or not. And the women were wrong like 50% of the time. So they had the women track their breast pain. They had women historically recount when their cycles were, and they tried to line them up, and the women were wrong a lot of the time. So they would say, oh yeah, I definitely have cyclical breast pain. And then it turns out their breast pain was haphazard or the opposite. So having women track their cycle has been a game changer for them understanding whether or not their symptoms are hormonal or not. And this specifically makes a huge difference when we're talking about things like migraines, which could either be hormonal or non-hormonal, or PMS, which certainly is hormonal, but also that PMS window of time just exacerbates any other mental health or mental illness that women struggle with, meaning that if they have anxiety, that PMS just becomes gasoline on her anxiety. And so having women track their symptoms, we can actually tell if she's having good days in the month or not. And if they're the days that she's having her symptoms, whether it's headaches or cramps or bloating or mood symptoms, actually correlate or line up with her hormonal symptoms. And that's a really important thing to do, especially for women who are over the age of 30, who are going to start to see some hormone changes over the next 10 to 15 years. Having a really solid understanding of what's going on with your hormones makes it so much easier for your medical professional to help you. To be able to say, yes, I have night sweats, and these are the days I have them. Or yes, I have bloating and insomnia, and these are the days that it's happening. And sometimes it's related to your cycle, and sometimes it isn't. But the difference in understanding that makes a remarkable difference for your physician. So if you haven't already, your 2021 goal is going to be to download a period tracker app. I don't have any affiliation with any of them. I've used a couple of different ones with patients, and I've used a couple of different ones myself. I think the ticket is just use. So if you open it up and you find it difficult to figure out how to punch in if you have a headache or not, your likelihood of doing it's really low. So I would say find an app where you find the interface pretty and easy to use and something that you can kind of show up with some consistency. And you want to start tracking things beyond just the days that you're bleeding. There definitely has been an evolution and trend in my practice. When I started working 15 years ago, women couldn't even tell me the day of their last menstrual period. Whereas now, with the advent of cycle apps, women are very clear on when their last period was, but maybe aren't tracking all the other symptoms in between. So that's something that if you haven't started already, that can be a great trend for you to focus on in 2021. So number 3 on Jordan's list of 2021 wellness trends is I want us to come back to vitamin D being something that we find exciting and important. I've done a couple of episodes on vitamin D recently, specifically on PMS, which we had so much feedback after that episode. If you haven't listened to that one, go listen, especially if you have a teenage daughter. This was something that's come up when multiple people reach out to us and say, should my teenage daughter be checked for vitamin D? So vitamin D, just as in short, we got really excited about vitamin D a few years ago. Although maybe it was 10. Now I say everything was a few years ago. I think it was a while ago. We got excited about vitamin D because A, we found that it was deficient in almost everyone, and we could see correlations between vitamin D and many significant health concerns, from autoimmunity to cancer. And this got really exciting. The challenge is when we started to try and give vitamin D for these conditions, we didn't really see those conditions improving. And that led us to believe that maybe vitamin D is actually not, it's a surrogate marker, I should say, meaning that it looks like it's connected, but it's actually flagging for something else. And what we sort of came to understand, especially with things like cancer risk, is that often vitamin D was a marker of outdoor exercise. And so people who didn't exercise outside were more at risk for cancer. And we just happened to find that they had vitamin D deficiency, but it was more of a flag for their low exercise outside. So that was something that we kind of noticed, and then it sort of de-emphasized the importance of vitamin D. And also because so many people are vitamin D deficient, we generally started to de-emphasize it in public health as well, with really broad low-dose recommendations for vitamin D, at least in Canada. And we de-emphasized the importance of testing. So testing became an out-of-pocket expense for women in the region that I live in Ontario. And that kind of did two things. One is it made us less excited about finding vitamin D deficiency, and it created barriers for people to even get their vitamin D levels tested because they needed to pay out of pocket for it. And then we made a bit of an assumption that the public health recommendations for everyone to take a low dose of vitamin D all the time were sufficient enough to actually fix the problem. And since we weren't really seeing these massive improvements in giving vitamin D to patients with autoimmunity and cancer and other conditions that were linked to vitamin D deficiency, it kind of fell off the table as being something that is important. Vitamin D's kind of surfaced again with the conversation around COVID, and I am not going to pretend that I'm an expert on this. I'm sure there are some people who are budding experts about this conversation and topic who know more than I do. But we do see an increased number of people who are getting infected with COVID-19 or showing symptoms with COVID-19 and having vitamin D deficiency. There's been some newspaper articles about vitamin D being linked to COVID-19 and the hospitalizations, et cetera, et cetera. And this, I'm not sure at this point, to be honest, if we can actually tease out this information any differently than any other information, because we also know that people who are having a harder time with the coronavirus also have obesity, also have hypertension, and we're back to this concept of perhaps they don't exercise outside. So whether or not vitamin D is directly linked to having worse outcomes with the virus, or whether or not it's a surrogate marker for other health and wellness challenges that patients may have that also puts them at risk for more significant disease with COVID. Either way, I think vitamin D's come back on the scene as being a thing that we want to test and that we don't want people to be deficient in. And I think if we just take it as that and we stop looking for something a little bit more concrete, it's still important for you not to be vitamin D deficient. Whether or not giving you vitamin D is going to cure your endometriosis or solve your PCOS, although we had a conversation last month about it maybe improving your PMS, I don't know if it's going to decrease your likelihood of getting infected with COVID or decreases a hospital stay if you ended up in the hospital with COVID. We still don't want people walking around vitamin D deficient. So whether or not it's related to COVID or not, I'm going to use this opportunity of it showing up in the news to remind ourselves that this is still something that's important. And it would be nice if this reemerged as a wellness trend for us to routinely test women with vitamin D deficiency. I know it's an out-of-pocket expense. It costs less than what you spend on coffee at Starbucks every month. And so if we can just reprioritize how important this particular nutrient is, it's a very topical discussion, given us talking about COVID for the last year in the world, that perhaps we can all shell out the little bit of money to get vitamin D tested over the next year to ensure that you're not walking around deficient for whatever reason we want to hang our hat on, whether it's reducing risk of cancer, whether it's improving autoimmunity, or whether it's solving your PMS. Either way, I don't want you to walk around vitamin D deficient. I would like you to have a conversation with your healthcare practitioner about it, and I would like that to be a value of yours in 2021. Let's turn that into a trend. Trend number 4 is about nutrition, and the conversation on the podcast about nutrition over the last year has really been about moving away from restrictive diet patterns. We've had conversations around disordered eating. We've had conversations around, elimination diets and their lack of evidence for supporting women with various health concerns. So I want to focus on something that you should be doing rather than something that you shouldn't be doing. I don't want the wellness trend of 2021 is to be don't have a restrictive diet, even though I think that is still a really important message. And if you missed some of those episodes, I would go back and listen. Some of them are just so great. What I do want the wellness trend to be for 2021 is for women to just focus on eating enough protein. I've watched a lot of diet trends over the last few years, and I will say every time a new diet trend comes out, it feels more extreme. It feels more emotional than the trend before. Right? We watched things like the Game Changers come out, which really, shed a negative light on eating animal protein. We've watched the keto diet, make claims and promises for women to miraculously lose a ton of weight. I've watched the carnivore diet now try and talk about, I don't even know what, to be perfectly honest. But I've watched like more and more of these extreme diets come out with so many rules, and they focus so much on like what kind of food you're eating, right? And labeling those foods as good or bad without actually giving education and foundational learning about nutritional basics, right? So I'll have women walk into my office and say, well, I heard legumes are bad because of this, or I've heard that soy is bad because of this, or I've heard that meat is bad because of this, without realizing that there are specific nutritional needs if we want to optimize for performance, and I mean performance in your life, not just in the gym. If we want to optimize for performance, there are some basic there's some basic understanding of what needs to happen with nutrition for women. How you achieve that may be less important, right? So I'm going to say that again in a different way. You have to eat enough protein. I don't care how you do it. And so often we focus on these like micro decisions in diet, right? Will goji berries cure me? Will this food, poison me? Versus thinking about the broad sweeping strokes of nutritional needs and helping women achieve a nutrition pattern that actually supports performance and personal and health growth versus creating deficiency and deficit. You need a certain amount of protein per day. Now, that amount may shift through your lifetime. It may shift based on what your personal goals are. But you have basic nutrition protein needs for performance. And for most women, they need somewhere between 1.5 and 1.7 grams per kilo per day. I'm waiting for you to get your calculator out so you can figure out what that is. But for most women, that means that their caloric intake of protein needs to sit somewhere between 20 and 30% of their calories, and probably puts them somewhere between 95 and 145 grams of protein per day. I'm sure there's some outliers there. Now, what this means is that many of those other trendy diets, when they give you all those food rules and haven't discussed what your basic nutritional needs are, may have shifted your diet away from this particular macronutrient and may have de-emphasized the importance of it. Now, I know that you've got lots of but Jordan statements going on in your head. But Jordan, I thought eating that much protein was bad. But Jordan, I didn't think we needed that much. But Jordan, da-da-da-da. That's what the research suggests. If you want to make a personal decision that, deviates from that, that's different. But we can't pretend that those are evidence-based decisions. And the reason that I harp on protein intake for women is really multifactorial. And remember that I have not subscribed to you having to eat a particular kind of protein here, because I'm definitely agnostic when it comes to which diet you choose. However, those basic building blocks and needs come from the concept of us trying to have disease reduction. Meaning that we reduce muscle loss and osteoporosis and frailty and hip fractures and all the things that we really want to prevent for our women in their 7th and 8th decade of life really hinges on her eating enough protein in her 3rd, 4th, and 5th decade of life. If we look at some of the other common health challenges that women have with weight management and obesity and diabetes and cardiovascular disease, we build a diet with success in mind and with satiety in mind, meaning that you're full by the foods you eat, by encouraging women to eat enough protein. And even if we just slide women an envelope across the table that says, eat X amount of protein, we'll see you in a year, those women actually manage their energy, their mood, their body composition, their weight, their blood sugar, their cardiovascular risks better than women who underfuel on that particular macronutrient. So if I wanted there to be any health and wellness trend around nutrition that was going to have a butterfly effect in your diet, or the biggest impact in your diet to start improving other parts of your nutrition relatively effortlessly, it would be to focus solely on that macronutrient. That is my one single piece of advice. That is the thing that I want to see as a health and wellness trend. I want us to encourage women to eat enough protein. I want to encourage a conversation about how we support muscle mass and metabolism in women through the use of protein. Number 5 is focusing on sleep and recovery. And this one, I honestly feel like I put it in for myself because I feel like this is something that I personally need to work on. But this also relates back to a conversation around burnout, probably loops us back into our conversation around self-compassion. In a nutshell, our stress response was not wired to be stressed forever. It was wired essentially to run away from an angry saber-toothed tiger, climb a tree, and get our blood pumping, blood sugar rushing, adrenaline going as quick as possible for a very physical output. Once we'd climbed the tree, the idea was that we were supposed to get instantly calm, then climb back down, go to our cave, and live happily ever after. Our stress response is wired exactly the same as that, except our stressors are really different, right? They're mostly psychological and not physical. We do way less running around our office when we get an email that we're mad about. and way more just sitting there and stewing. And yet our body is responding exactly the same as if we were going to like run away from the email. But the other big difference is the chronicity of our stress. And we're starting to see an evolution in the way we talk about stress and burnout and PTSD in the literature to acknowledge the long-term consequences of long-term stress. So this is a really topical conversation given the last year, because whether or not you felt truly impacted by the COVID-19 crisis and pandemic and quarantine, it still was this like slow, nagging distress. Whether you looked at the news every day or not, your life had shifted in response to what was going on. So there's this slow burn of stress and discomfort and worry and wondering if you truly had the resources to cope with the uncertainty of what was coming. And that's truly like what gets our stress response going. And it's the difference between feeling overwhelmed and feeling resilient, is whether or not we feel like we have the resources to navigate or manage the stressors that are coming our way. And sometimes giving a speech to 1,000 people doesn't feel stressful, right? We feel super prepared. We know the mic is working, everything's great, and we can get up there and give her. And then there's moments where finding a parking spot at IKEA is an overwhelming task and we burst into tears. And really that just has to do with whether or not our brain perceives the situation as threatening, or whether it perceives us as having enough coping basically to handle what's coming at us. It's called allostatic load, which maybe we'll have that conversation on another day. The reason I want rest and recovery and sleep to be part of our wellness trends for 2021 is that we are recognizing the importance of rest and sleep and recovery from burnout. We're recognizing that the level of demand, both psychologically and physically, on most people's day is not being met with the same level of rest and recovery. And so your nervous system is actually becoming wired to thrive on adrenaline, right? Your nervous system is actually forgetting what it feels like to do nothing, to have peace, because of the amount of stimuli, right? Whether it's Instagram or whether it's work or whether it's homeschooling your kids. That's happening on a continuous basis. It's changing the way that our body and stress response is actually functioning, which is having a negative impact on our sleep, to be honest. But it's actually making it more of an emphasis that we need to have rest as a priority for us going into 2021 in order for us to persevere, because we certainly are not through the pandemic, but also on that road to recovery from burnout. There's some neat studies that look at things like catch-up sleep in healthcare workers and the impact of them catching an extra 30 or 45 minutes of sleep here and there, and the impact that that has on their resiliency and their ability to show up at work. There's certainly been a plethora of research on the impact of rest on performance for athletes, which I think we all see. Like, I love using this athlete example because we can easily be like, oh yeah, that football player totally needs to drink a lot of water and go to bed. And then for some reason, like as a woman and mother and CEO and whatever we are, we don't think we need those things, or we don't prioritize those things. And yet we have to perform very similarly in our lives. So we know very acutely that the more rest and recovery that athletes have, they have the ability to show up, not just physically, but also mentally in their work, meaning their sport as well. And so we certainly would want to prioritize that. The reason I want this to be a trend also is that I am seeing this shift in wearable devices and patients actually being acutely aware of how many hours of sleep they're getting. Whereas I used to have to ask, how's your sleep? And people would be like, meh, right? Like they would have very little to say about it. They didn't have a routine. They didn't have sleep equipment, right? They didn't have a face mask or a weighted blanket or any of these things. I'm starting to see the conversation shift where people are noticing that their Fitbit says they've been awake 1,000,000 times in the night, or they have curiosity about upgrading their wearable to track their sleep, or they have curiosity about having a sleep study to assess for sleep apnea, where I used to have to drag people to get a sleep study done. So I want this trend to continue. I think we've started to notice the importance of rest and recovery. I want us to further and deepen our relationship with it, where we start to recognize that sleep is not a thing that happens in the last 2 minutes when you lie down to go to bed. right? Sleep is a thing that you build all day with your habits and behaviors, just like your nutrition, right? That sleep is something that we are literally the only species on Earth that voluntarily restricts our sleep, right? There are no mama chimpanzees staying up to make brownies for the bake sale. She goes to bed. And really, the only times that the cheetah stays awake all night is if he's in danger or if he's hungry. You can imagine the hormonal cascade that's happening in that cheetah when he stays up all night. So the same thing is happening to us when we do it too. And it really has a negative impact on our nutrition. So we have a hard time eating well. Even after one day of sleep restriction, we don't eat well. And we have a hard time managing our mood, a hard time managing our stress, and it has this ripple effect into almost every chronic disease out there. Meaning that if you're suffering with a chronic condition, sleep deprivation is gasoline on your condition. And we really want to change that. And so I want that to be a new health and wellness trend. I personally have worked with a few different wearables over the last year. And early in the year, I found that the one wearable that I had wasn't really changing my behavior, but it did help me acknowledge that I wasn't prioritizing sleep as much as I could be. And I've definitely worked over the rest of the year to try and prioritize sleep and rest a little bit more, even if it's just to get a little bit more sleep. I used to race to wake up really early and try and wake up before my kids so that I could get some work done, especially in the middle of the pandemic, where I realized that that was actually just creating a problem for me. I wasn't any more productive because I was awake longer. And it was actually better for me to sleep, without an alarm and wake up a little bit more naturally. I certainly didn't sleep in. That's still something that I can't physically do, it seems. But just getting that extra half an hour, 45 minutes does make a big difference. Okay, on to number 6. I don't know who has a top 6 wellness trends of 2021 list, but I do. Number 6 is a gratitude practice. And I've talked about this in other episodes, and you can go listen to an entire episode I did with the founders of Love Powered Co., specifically talking about gratitude and affirmations. But I do want this to become a trend for 2021. I think that flexing that gratitude muscle, even in the moments where we don't feel particularly well, actually helps change and rewire our brain and our experience of our stressors. It helps us feel more in control of the things that we're experiencing from day to day. And the research on gratitude practice is actually so positive. I love interventions that are cheap and easy and impactful, right? And so this is something that you can do for free. This is something that you can do with a $5 journal from the bookstore. And the impact that it can have is, far outweighs what we could probably do with with a supplement or with some kind of, other intervention. I think the impact that we can have with this in particular is really positive. And I love when something's so cheap and easy. I think what I want to see happen in 2021 for your gratitude practice, for my gratitude practice, is the trend of doing it with a level of consistency that's like unwavering. I use this example when I talk to patients and I remind them, do you remember when we were teenagers and you would only write in your diary when you were mad, right? Do you remember when you would sit down and write in your diary when you were mad at your parents? It wasn't very often that we sat down and wrote in our diary, but when we were happy, right? or maybe you only wrote about one topic, right? You would write about someone that you had a crush on, but you wouldn't write about anything else. And what I want our gratitude practice to do is to move beyond that kind of practice. I don't want it to be I'm grateful for my Christmas tree because I'm sitting here and it's super peaceful and my kids are being good and my dog is sleeping and I have a cup of coffee. That's easy, right? It's easy to be grateful in that moment because nothing is going wrong. Being grateful despite obstacles, or seeing silver lining in a hard day, or seeing the fleck of gratitude in a really difficult time, that is a muscle that needs to be flexed. And the more often we do it, the easier it comes. And the evidence and research on gratitude shows that as well. It's similar to meditation, right? Like meditating when you're already calm is easy. It's meditating when you're stressed that's more difficult, but perhaps more impactful. Because when those habits become unwavering, right, that's where we actually start to see the effect of it ripple into the rest of your life. That's where you can see that, like at 3 o'clock in the afternoon on a Friday when you get a terrible email, that you can actually navigate it better, right? Or in a moment where you're feeling overwhelmed as a parent, that you can actually see the humor in it. That our ability to see and have that gratitude in those moments of difficulty only comes with practicing it, not just in the good moments. I like that phrase that says, if you only walk on sunny days, you won't get to your destination. And this idea of what I want our gratitude practice to look like for 2021 is that exactly. So if we do it when things are going well, you're not actually flexing the muscle in a way that helps you develop that deep resiliency. Remember, we started the conversation today about how when, shit hit the fan at the beginning of COVID, our routines were not robust enough to actually survive. This is the same conversation. So again, when we only do things when we feel well and we don't do them when we don't feel well, we don't build the momentum, right? You don't see the benefit and you don't actually get to reap the reward of having practiced that behavior over and over again. And so what I want for your gratitude practice for 2021 is for it to be an unwavering pattern that you do every single day, because I've watched it transform my patients' lives. I've watched it improve my mental health as well. I think that that's a health and wellness trend that we should get behind because of how easy and impactful it is. And certainly we could all use a bit more joy going into 2021. Lastly, I want to close out the episode with talking a little bit about what our goals are for 2021 for the podcast. I've got some great guests lined up for the first quarter of the podcast. And really, my goal is for us to reach as many women as possible. I don't have a number goal because I felt like I was putting a cap on what my reach goals were for women. But part of that reach comes from wonderful listeners like you who make it all the way to the end of every episode. And we get so many messages and emails and feedback from women saying that they've honestly listened to every episode. We had one the other week. A woman was like, I am not trying to get pregnant, and yet I listened to the fertility episodes because I can't just not listen. So I would love if you take a moment to share the podcast with the women in your life. And that's either through conversation or sharing the link. Any way that we can expand and increase the reach makes a huge difference for the movement and momentum that we're trying to have in women's health. My goal is for the podcast to be empowering and to give women the language that they need to advocate for better healthcare wherever they live. And we've had women reach out who listen in Holland, who listen in Brazil, who listen across the States, who listen in New Zealand. It's amazing the impact and the spread of this conversation that we've been able to have, because we really are all having this, shared experience as women. And I think the more that we pull together, the more that we can make this a trend, because we're all paying attention, we're all talking about it. That's how we make it trendy. And so I would love if, you could spare a moment to share the podcast with a woman in your life who you think would benefit from our content. Share on social media and tag me at Dr. Jordan ND, whether that's on Facebook or on Instagram. We always repost all of those shares because we're so grateful for all of our listeners who are helping us increase the number of women that we can reach. I really look forward to the podcast in 2021. 2020 was a cool year of growth for us. We rebranded the podcast. We had so many wonderful guests on the show, and I got to do a lot of intimate solo episodes with you too, where we could dive deep on some great women's health topics. If you've missed listening to a couple of them, I would highly encourage you go back and listen to some of those episodes. We've got some great content, and there's something there for everyone. I hope you enjoyed that episode of Women's Health Unplugged. It's my absolute passion to bring women quality and science-informed information about their health so that they can make empowered, good decisions about their healthcare. I'd like to invite you to join me in my Facebook community, Women's Health Unplugged. There we share live videos, blog posts, and behind-the-scenes information about the podcast, where you can connect with me and other women who are interested in their healthcare. You can find us at facebook.com/groups/WH Unplugged. We'll see you there.